Edinburgh is so rich in history that it's going to take more than one of these films to even scratch the surface. So we'll start by exploring the road that runs between Edinburgh Castle and Holyrood House, which is known as the Royal Mile. It is just about a mile long, and it runs right through the centre of the area known as the Old Town, until it gets down to the park at the bottom, which lies in the shadow of the extinct volcano known as Arthur's Seat and the Salisbury Crags. In 1128, whilst hunting in these grounds, King David I of Scotland had a religious vision. It was of a crucifix, and it prompted him to build an abbey on the site, which he called Holyrood, or Holy Cross. The King of Scotland started using the associated buildings as a pleasant retreat from Edinburgh Castle. And at the beginning of the 16th century, in preparation for his marriage to Henry VIII's sister Margaret, King James IV of Scotland built a fabulous manor house. This and the abbey were severely damaged during what was known as the Rough Wooing by Henry VIII in the 1540s. However, after the restoration of the British monarchy in 1660, King Charles II ordered a new palace to be built, perhaps emulating his cousin Louis XIV's Palace of Versailles. For a while, Mary Queen of Scots lived in the palace and married two of her husbands, Darnley and Bothwell, there. The apartments she used can still be visited, as can the room where, on the 9th of March 1566, her secretary David Rizzio, a young Italian, was murdered by Lord Darnley and some of his associates. Holyrood remains the official residence of the monarch in Scotland, and the Queen spends at least 1 week a year there. In the gardens of the palace is a small building known as Queen Mary's Bathhouse. It was probably never used for bathing as such, but probably just as a room to relax in during walking in the park, or whilst hunting or practicing archery. You know, the sort of thing that wealthy royals did in those days. If you look carefully just outside the palace walls, you will find some of these stones marked with an S. This signifies the sanctuary that the abbey was able to give to those who were being pursued, perhaps for a debt. This building, now a gift shop of course, was where those seeking sanctuary would be accommodated. In the same parkland and across the road from Holyrood is Scotland's new Parliament building. Its genesis was plagued by controversy from the beginning. It opened in 2004, 3 years later than planned, and at a cost of nearly 10 times its original estimate. However, despite some criticism, the building has been generally welcomed and has won numerous architectural prizes, including in 2005 the Stirling Prize. So with these two icons, the old and the new, sitting together at the bottom of the Royal Mile, we can then turn our way up the hill and start going back towards the castle, with many interesting things to see along the way. The first building to note is the Canongate Church, built in 1688, and it took over from the Holyrood Abbey as the parish church for the Canongate area. At the time, Canongate was a separate parish from Edinburgh. We shall see where the boundary between the two was shortly. Outside the church is the statue of Robert Fergusson, who was a poet who died at the age of 24. He was the inspiration and influence on Robert Burns, and he was buried in the churchyard of the Canongate Kirk. His grave was originally unmarked, but Robert Burns paid for a memorial stone to be erected, and in a later generation, Robert Louis Stevenson paid for it to be restored. Also in this churchyard, behind these railings, lies the tomb of Adam Smith, author of the book The Wealth of Nations. He was one of the great figures of the Scottish Enlightenment. A little further up the road we come to the Tolbooth Tavern. This has been a pub for over 200 years, but was originally, as the name says, a toll booth where you would pay the levy to be able to enter the gates of Edinburgh city proper. The city gates were actually here, at what is known as the World's End, because of course to the residents of Edinburgh city, the gates were the end of their world. There are brass plates on the street here showing where the city gates would have stood. A must for all whisky lovers is Cadenhead's, Scotland's oldest independent bottlers. The company was founded in 1842. Not only does this small shop have a huge array of bottled whiskies from all parts of Scotland, but they will also bottle for you a whisky of your choice directly from the cask as it comes from the distillery. And you can't get closer to the real thing than that. The Royal Mile is famous for the network of alleyways that run off the main street. These are called closes because they could be closed at night as a matter of security. Some of these lead down to other streets, some lead to squares where there are tenements, and some of them into small park and garden areas where you can sit and relax and be far away from the crowds outside. Back now to the Royal Mile, which because of the lockdown we're able to film in a fairly quiet and tranquil mood. Wait till you see what this looks like when the festival is on. Dating back to the 12th century, St Giles Cathedral stands magnificent in its square. Now, a cathedral is the seat of the local bishop, but as the Church of Scotland, of which St Giles is the High Kirk, does not have bishops since the Reformation, it is not strictly speaking a cathedral at all, and hasn't been since the 17th century. However, the title still remains. Next to St Giles there used to stand a prison called the Tolbooth Prison. These brass plates show the outline of the foundations of that prison. It held many political prisoners, and there were many executions just outside the prison. This mosaic, called the Heart of Midlothian, marks the place where this gallows used to stand. And it is customary for locals to spit on the Heart of Midlothian as they pass it, as a sign of their disrespect for the old prison. Also in the square is a statue of David Hume, the philosopher and prominent member of the Scottish Enlightenment. Before the political union of Scotland and England in 1707, the Scottish Parliament was held here in Parliament Square behind St Giles. The equestrian statue of King Charles II, which was raised just after his death in 1685, is the oldest statue in Edinburgh and is made entirely of lead. St Giles houses the chapel of the Order of the Thistle. The three stained glass windows which can be seen here from the outside, and which date from the beginning of the 20th century, have as a nod to this ancient Scottish order of chivalry representation of angels playing bagpipes. And it's for this reason that the restaurant across the road from the church has the name that it has. Just around the corner from King Charles's statue is the Market Cross. There has been a Market Cross or a market cross here for hundreds of years. This particular one dates from Victorian times. The Market Cross was a place where people could meet and chat and find out what was going on, and where the Lord Provost or other dignitaries could make announcements of matters that were important to the locals at the time. The building behind it, with the arched entrance, is the Royal Exchange. And the animal which sits on top of the column on the Market Cross is the unicorn, which is the national animal of Scotland. Across the road from there is this pub, dedicated to the memory of one of Edinburgh's most notorious criminals, Deacon Brodie, a man who lived a double life, pillar of society by day and burglar by night. He is said to be the inspiration for Robert Louis Stevenson's creation of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In the 17th century, the first public water supply was implemented in Edinburgh. Water was brought from springs outside the town to this reservoir just outside the gates of Edinburgh Castle. It was then pumped down to a number of wells around the town, many of them on the Royal Mile, and some of which still exist today, although not providing water. This one is just outside the house that used to be lived in by John Knox, the father of Scottish Reformation. Towards the top of the Royal Mile, you'll find Lady Stairs Close, another tranquil square which houses the Writers' Museum, dedicated to three of Edinburgh's greatest literary figures, Sir Walter Scott, Robert Louis Stevenson, and of course Robert Burns. We'll now move up Castle Hill towards the entrance to Edinburgh Castle itself. Before we get there, we find the Witches' Well, erected to commemorate more than 300 women who were executed as witches during the reign mainly of King James VI of Scotland and I of England, a man who was obsessed by witchcraft and wrote a book called Demonology. Opposite the well is the Cannonball Restaurant, so called because lodged in the wall above one of the windows is a cannonball. There are a number of romantic stories as to how it got there, but the reason is likely to be the more prosaic idea that it was placed there by engineers to determine the actual height at that point above sea level. They needed to know this to aid the flow of the water to the wells that we saw earlier on. The water was kept in a reservoir just across the road from the Cannonball Restaurant and the one which is now the tartan weaving shop. And finally, on this part of the journey, we come to the castle itself. A fortress and a royal palace, it never fails to impress, and it takes thousands and thousands of tourists every year. As well as wonderful views across the city and out to the Firth of Forth, you will also find a military museum, you'll find the housing of the Scottish Crown Jewels, and much more covering 1,000 years of the castle's history. Within the grounds of the castle is Edinburgh's oldest building, that's St Margaret's Chapel. It was built in the 12th century, believed to have been built by King David I in memory of his mother, Queen Margaret, who died in 1083, but who was later canonised and is known as St Margaret of Scotland. The castle is also home to Mons Meg, an enormous cannon given to James II in 1457. Every summer, during the festival, the enormous esplanade leading up to the castle gates is transformed into the arena that is the home to the Edinburgh military tattoo, a spectacular event held every night during the month of August and featuring military bands and personnel from armies all over the world. It's a truly staggering occasion, visited by thousands of people every year. And what better way of ending this part of the tour than with the massed pipes and drums of the Scottish regiments. Come back again soon for more parts of Edinburgh that you might not know about. Bye for now.